So, hi Bruno,
No.
we are recording this second time. I hope that now everything will be good. We will continue our discussion about Władysław Gomułka. It is third episode. I invite you to watch our first conversation, which was about the events in the Baltic coast, and second episode about biography of Gomułka before 1966. So today we will talk about the period of the power of Gomułka, 1966 until 1970. And I would like to start about events in 1968 and the accusation Gomułka of the anti-Semitism. So Bruno, let's talk.
Okay. Okay. So before talking about the 1968 events, we have to just to remind something quite important. It is the reason why people joined before the Second World War the communist movement in Poland. Of course, basically, the communist movement was a movement recruiting in the working class for class reasons. But you had also in Poland a very big issue concerning national minorities, and especially Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Jewish minority, which were very numerous in Poland. And quite a lot of people joined the communist movement for a reason of internationalism rather than for reason of class reason. I mean, people from Jewish origin joining the party, belonging rather to what we can call middle class, or even bourgeois intellectuals, joining this party because they, of course, were against a nationalist state of Poland. That's one basic reason. And in the 50s, it means at the time when Gomułka was under arrest and that Poland was working with a, let's say, pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin line, quite a large number of leaders were from Jewish origins. Especially in the security service, but not only, in the medias also. And they were considered as tough Stalinists. They were considered as tough Stalinists because they were fighting very strongly against everything that can look like Polish nationalism outside the communist movement, but even inside the communist movement. And things began to change after 1953, when we had in Moscow the process against some doctors, and for quite a lot of people of Jewish origin. This event, whatever we think about it, is supposed to have been considered as some form of anti-Semitism. But we have also to take into account one fact, which is very important. It is the fact that Soviet Union did support Zionists in Palestine at the beginning of the 40s. Thinking that the state of Israel will be a progressive state fighting against pro-British colonial Arab monarchies. And after the creation of Israel, Golda Meir came to Moscow in 1948 or 49, I don't remember, and a very massive rally of Jewish people from Moscow greeted her and for the direction of the Soviet Communist Party, it was something that showed that quite a lot of Jews in Soviet Union are rather Zionist-oriented than communist-oriented. And it began to create a gap between the Communist Party and, let's say, part of the Jewish minority in Soviet Union. But we had the same thing in Poland, because in 1955, 1956, when de-Stalinization process, let's say, began in Soviet Union, quite a large part of the very hardline Stalinists in the Communist Party, in the United Workers' Party, began to change their line on very, let's say, revisionistic and very liberal direction. Let's say the people who came in the party during the Stalinist era, basic members, were very shocked by the sudden change of line of different people like Zambrowski, like Mintz and other people, Berman even, because they created, inside the party, some of them created the so-called Puławy faction, which was rather a liberal and revisionistic fraction, and quite a lot of let's say, hardline Stalinists were became to feel that they were betrayed by these people. And the element we have to notice is that quite a large part of these people, which went from the hardline Stalinist line to the liberal revisionistic line, were from Jewish origin. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And this created the idea within the Polish party that some Jews went into the communist movement not because of class reason, but for nationalistic reason. They wanted to have the support of Soviet Union, not to create a communist society, but to fight against Polish nationalism. And this led this fraction of the party, these people in the party, to the opinion that, in fact, during the Second World War, the Jewish proletariat was destroyed by Hitler, and survived only the bourgeoisie, the Jewish bourgeoisie, which was inside the party after the Second World War. Of course, this theory can be contested, but anyway, it's a theory that was spread in the party, in some fraction of the party. And that's the one reason that made the so-called Jewish issue in the Polish party after 1956 very important. And in this situation, we had the development of the so-called partisan fraction, which was under the leadership of Mieczysław Moczar, who was the Ministry of Interior, of Internal Affairs, who was not a real Pole. In fact, Moczar is from Ukrainian or Belarusian origin. He's not from Polish origin. But anyway, he developed a very strongly nationalistic view of communism in Poland, something like, let's say, national communism. And he organized his fraction, especially among the former war occupation resistance movement activist, and that's why he was called the partisan fraction. And that's for sure some of his, it's difficult to say if he was anti-Semitic or if all people going behind him were anti-Semitic, but what is sure is that some of these people began to be more anti-Semitic than anti-Zionist. Officially, they were anti-Zionist, but we can observe that some of their argumentation was rather anti-Semitic and not anti-Zionist. That's for sure. But anyway, this develops in a Poland where this tension existed inside the party, And Gomułka was the leader of the party, but Gomułka was not a member of this fraction. Gomułka was trying to control the party and the different fraction we had in the party. For sure, Gomułka was not a communist because one of the proof he was not a communist is that his wife was Jewish.
Oh, he's not anti-Semite.
Yeah, anti-Semite. Yeah. Excuse. He was not anti-Semite, and his wife is from Jewish origin, and she was a tough, hardline anti-Zionist. But of course, she couldn't be anti-Semitic. She was Jewish from origin, but she considered that Zionism is a perversion of the Jewish tradition, just like extreme right nationalism. Polish nationalism is bad for Poles. Zionism is bad for Jews, and that's one thing. The second thing we have to take into account is the fact that in Poland we had a very curious organization which was created after the Second World War under the protection of Serov, which was the second leader of the NKVD, of the state security of Soviet Union. After Beria, Serov was the second man of that institution. And in 1944, when he was in Lublin, when he was in the part of the Poland that was liberated from the German occupation, he came to the Lublin prison, where he met one of the fascist, of course, fascist leader of the pre-war Poland, and during the war, and he created a resistance, anti-German resistance movement, which was officially fascistic and anti-Semitic, even if he was fighting against German. He was fighting, in fact, against German. He was not fighting against Nazism. We have to say he is called Bolesław Piasecki, and Piasecki was supposed, of course, to be shot because during the war he fought not only Germans but, of course, communists and killed some Jews as being anti-Semitic. But he was freed. And Serov decided that it was a good idea to let this far-right organization be created, so to put some fraction of the Polish society with really extreme right feelings inside the institution better than outside the institution. And Bolesław Piasecki created then the so-called Pax movement, which was a not very strong organization, but which was an organization that had about 5 or 6 members of parliament all the time after the Second World War. This organization had one daily paper, which is Słowo Powszechne. This organization had the monopoly to distribute and sell religious items, and it has a network of shops, of religious item shops all over Poland that gave her money, and he had also a very good, we have to recognize on the intellectual level, a very good publishing house, which is called Pax, which was a good publishing house, and quite a lot of good books of literature and history were published by Pax Publishing, even if we have to recognize that Pax was a fascistic or non-officially fascistic organization, but in fact it was a fascistic organization. And in 1948, Bolesław Piasecki told something very interesting at one of his meetings. and it was published. It was officially published in Poland, in People's Poland. He declared that some people are telling that we betrayed Polish nationalism because we are on the side of communists, but in fact we didn't betray our tradition. Communists came on our line, we didn't went on their line because we were fighting for a Slavic empire. We have a Slavic empire under Stalin's direction. We were fighting for nationalism. We have a nationalist government. We were fighting for a Poland extended to Western territories. We have a Poland extended to Western territories, etc., etc. So communists now are on our side. We are not on their side. They are on our side. And it was published in 1948 in the Polish press, and it was the censorship accepted that argumentation. And during all the line, all the time after the Second World War, PAX was one of the most pro-Soviet oriented fraction. Even in 1956, when Gomułka came back to power, the Słowo Powszechne was the only daily Polish daily that called the Soviet army to come to Poland, overthrew Gomułka, and proclaim martial law. So he was very, very hard pro-Soviet, but not because of class reason, but because of nationalistic rational reason. Soviet Union is the leadership of Slavs in the world, and we have to support Soviet Union as a Slavic empire, not as a communist Marxist-Leninist empire, but we have to be on Soviet line because Soviet Union is the fatherland of Slavs. Against German imperialism and so on and so on. But also, the only thing he changed officially, Piasecki, after the Second World War, is the fact that officially he ceased to be anti-Semitic, that he became anti-Zionist. But of course, it's pure theory. In practice, he was always anti-Semitic, and he played quite a strong role in 1968 to give to this so-called anti-Zionist campaign a very strong anti-Semitic tone. So we have to take into account that I told earlier about Mozart within the Polish party, but we have also to take into account the PAX and Piasecki group outside the Polish party, but inside Polish institution, because PAX was member of the institutions of the states, and that's important. And we have to acknowledge that Piasecki, at the beginning in 1956, he was against Gomułka, but what is interesting is that Gomułka didn't eliminate his group and accepted later the fact that Piasecki and the PAX group should exist legally as it did earlier. And that shows, of course, that the situation in People's Poland was ideologically very complicated from the very beginning to the very end of this period. And this makes us understand, whatever we think about Gomułka, that Gomułka was not in a very strong situation. The situation of the Polish United Workers' Party was very complicated inside the Polish society, and was also very complicated inside itself. It means the different fraction of the within the Polish United Workers' Party from the very beginning of its existence in 1948 was a mixture of old communists with old socialists, social democrats from the PPS, and a mixture of, let's say, internationalist Marxists and rather they would have called themselves patriotic communists, but we can, of course, say they were national communists rather than patriotic communists. Of course, all this situation is due to a lot of historical background that we will not talk about. But in fact, of course, the national issue in Poland was always complicated by the history of Poland in the 19th and the 20th century. Complicated for the relation, especially for the relation between Poland and Russia, and consequently between Poland and Soviet Union, and also very complicated by the fact that it was difficult to find a common acceptance of who is a Pole. A Pole is supposed, for some Poles, to be Slav, Polish-speaking, and from Catholic tradition. Even if he is an atheist, he is supposed to come from the Catholic tradition. And we have also in Poland people in the left, but not only in the left. For example, Piłsudski was also supporting that idea that a Pole is something born in the Polish territory, and the question of his origin, of the language he's speaking at home, is not important. Important is his relation to the Polish state tradition. So we have something like a Polish state nationalism, and we have something like a Polish ethnical nationalism. And this problem is existing all over Poland up till now. Who is a real Pole? But the problem is that this problem also happened within the communist movement. That's, for example, why the Communist Party, after when it was founded in the pre-war period, decided to be called Communist Party of Poland and not Polish Communist Party. In the Second World War, they decided to be called Polish Workers' Party because it was the party of the Poles. And this was, of course, a decision that was discussed with Stalin. And Stalin arrived to the conclusion that it was better to call it Polish Workers' Party and not Workers' Party of Poland, so the Poles can most easily identify themselves with this party, not only as a party of the working class, but also as a party of the Polish nation. During the war and the occupation against, of course, German imperialism and German Nazism. And all this situation, and the problem is, of course, that after the Second World War, during the Gomułka times, but also during the Bierut time, this was never cleared, because the Polish United Workers' Party was always fighting to have the approval of the majority of the Polish people. But of course, it started with a relatively low level of acceptance in the society in 1944, since quite a lot of leftist Polish movement were not really prepared to cooperate with communists. The communists forced them to cooperate, the socialist and the agrarian or peasant movement, but in fact there was always something like ambiguity on the national question. And of course, we can say that Moczar exploited this situation. But I would say Moczar did exploit this situation. I will never say that Gomułka did. Gomułka, we can, of course, discuss to which extent he was Marxist, to which extent he was Leninist, and so on. That's an issue that we have to discuss about. But anyway, Gomułka was never, let's say, nationalistically minded. He just wanted to take into account the fact that nationalism is very strong in Poland for a historical reason, and that communists should take that into account if they want to conquer, let's say, the heart of the Polish people. So I would say that the nationalism of Gomułka was something like an opportunism. It's exactly the same situation concerning collectivization. Gomułka was always in favor of collectivization. And in the 60s, when he was leading Poland, he was all the time pushing peasants to go to the state farm, but the PGR in Polish. But the difference he had with, let's say, the Stalinist way of collectivization is that he thought that in Poland it cannot be realized by, let's say, administrative means. It has to be done slightly convincing people to the PGR, to the state farm. And in a certain extent, he did realize that, because if we take into account statistically the fact that in 1956, when he accepted that the peasants who joined cooperatives had the right to go out from this, the level of collectivization went down to 10% of the land, and 90% was private. At the end of the Gomułka era, it means in 1970, we had back 25% of the land belonging to state or cooperative farms. So exactly the same proportion.
Hello?
And Gomułka allowed peasants to leave a cooperative. So in a certain sense, Gomułka took back the collectivization situation we had in 1955, 1956. Of course, if we are strictly Marxist-Leninist, we must condemn that as a strong concession to, let's say, petit bourgeois economy. That's for sure. But we cannot accept the fact that Gomułka was against collectivization. He was for collectivization, but step by step. And on the same line, he was not for Polish nationalism, but he took into account the fact that in Poland, nationalism is very strong, and if you force Polish people to love Soviet Union, they will never love you Soviet Union for ideological reason. They must first consider Soviet Union as an ally against German imperialism, and step by step change their mind towards Soviet Union from an ally against German imperialism to a friend and brother on ideological question. But of course, what I say now is in contradiction with the position of Moczar. Moczar was, I don't know if Moczar was really a nationalist. As I told you, he was from something like a Belarusian Ukrainian origin. And it often happens in history that people that are not really sure of their belongings are much more hardline than people who know who they are. And to a certain extent, we can suppose that the fact that Moczar was not really a pure Pole made him an ultra Pole. Or maybe just it was a question of opportunism in his ranks. And also, there is also another element. Mieczysław Moczar was somebody that during the war created a partisan group in the Kielce region, where he fought, of course, the Nazi occupant. But for some reason, we don't really know why. He he was considered by Soviets in Poland, Soviet, of course, underground, let's say, secret service organization. He was considered as somebody not reliable. And during the Stalin era, Moczar was, let's say, put on very, very, very secondary functions, and that made him rather anti-Soviet. To a certain extent, of course, anti-Soviet. So he had two, let's say, two elements of traditional Polish nationalism. It means the relation toward Jews that was more than anti-Zionist, and the relation towards Soviet Union that was not really strictly communist, but let's say Polish nationalism. And then in 1956, he succeeded to be Minister of the Internal Issues, and of course this position made him very important in the political game, since he had information about every citizen he wanted to have in Poland. Second question is, as I told you, quite a lot of Jews during the pre-war period joined the communist movement for internationalistic reason, and not really for, anti-Polish nationalist reason, and not because of class reason. And this situation changed, as I told you, in 1953 and 1956, since quite a lot of these Jews within the party began to think that Soviet Union is not really a country where anti-Semitism has disappeared for different reasons. We will not talk about that because it's another question. But anyway, and this made progressively some of Jews, and especially their children, look in a different way toward Zionism and toward the state of Israel. And of course, in 1967, when the Arab-Israeli war started, when the Soviet Union and all the Soviet, the socialist country except Romania, sided on the side of Arabs and of socialist Egypt and Syria against pro-American Israel, then it happened within the Polish party that some leaders from Jewish origin didn't approve the position of Polish state that cut diplomatic relation with Tel Aviv, and took the side of Soviet Union, of Egypt and Syria against Israel. And Moczar then took this situation as a pretext to launch this anti-Zionist campaign, accusing a lot of, let's say, important functionaries of the state or the party that, in fact, they are agents of Israel, that they are not Polish patriots, that they are not communist, that they are on the side of the enemy of People's Poland. Of course, this campaign began before the March event. This campaign was directed, in fact, not only against Polish people from Jewish origin that took side of Israel, but was directed very quickly against every people from Jewish origin having quite a strong position inside the party or inside the state administration. And it's joined this process joined in March 1978 with another process. It is the riots that were organized at the universities by students who were theoretically criticizing and demonstrating against the fact that one piece of theater, a traditional theater show, Diady, it's a very important 19th century Mickiewicz play, quite a lot, and this play, which was anti-Tsarist, in fact, could be interpreted as anti-Russian. It means nationalistically Polish and anti-Russian. And the Gomułka administration decided that the way this play was carried on was, in fact, unofficially anti-Soviet. And the show was cancelled. And this was a pretext for student movement to begin against the student and intellectual movement, which was created by, let's say, the revisionists from 1956 to demonstrate against Polish state, against People's Poland, against Communist Party, under some, let's say, left-wing social democrat slogans. But in fact, quite a lot of the organizers of the demonstration were revisionists, but also were sons of well-known Polish leaders from the Stalinist era, but leaders known that to have changed their mind from Stalinism in the, let's say, beginning of the 50s to strong anti-Stalinism against around 1955, 1956. And this element allowed Moczar to pretend that these riots were organized by Zionists. Of course, the Jewish element inside these riots is real, but is not the basic reason of these riots, and it has nothing to do with, let's say, Zionist plot wanting to take power in Poland. It has rather to do with tension inside Polish society and inside especially the middle, what we call today the middle classes. What is very important is that the 1968 events were not supported by working class. Even working class workers were organized to demonstrate against those demonstrators, against students and intellectuals. And there is something like a, let's say, class struggle in 1968. Gomułka, anyway, accepted in March, April, the decision put by Moczar to purge, let's say, the party of a lot of people from Jewish origin, and that's why he is accused of anti-Semitism. But very, very quickly, so 2 or 3 months after that, he corrected, let's say, the line in a discourse where he very strongly declared that there is a basic difference between people of Jewish origin who are Polish patriots and patriots of the Polish People's Republic and Zionists, and we have to make the difference between Zionism and Jews, and between, of course, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So these events of 1968 were very short, and Gomułka was in a difficult position, and to a certain extent we can even assume the fact that Gomułka managed to take back the control of the situation for two reasons. One reason is because he was one of the main leaders in the socialist camp advocating an intervention in Czechoslovakia that happened in August 1968, because he was really one of the most anti-Dubček socialist leader of the time, and this made him supported by Soviet leadership under Brezhnev, and we can assume that the help of Soviet Union managed to save, let's say, Gomułka as the leader of Polish People's Republic in 1968 against Moczar, who was trying, of course, to take advantage of his so-called anti-Zionist campaign to conquer the power and eliminate Gomułka on that line. And anyway, everything I said is showing one thing very important, and we have to take into account. We can, of course, have whatever we want opinion against or for People's Poland, for the regime under Gomułka and so on, but we have to take into account what very basic fact anti-communist propaganda doesn't accept, that all these issues, all these fights, all these problems we had in Poland shows one very important thing, that Poland was a sovereign country, and that we had in Poland very different factions inside the Polish party, which were Polish-based and which were not tools of Soviet, let's say, Soviet hegemony. So Soviet was a sovereign country, and problems we had in the 60s were very Polish problems and were not linked with a supposed Soviet domination. Poland was not dominated by Soviet Union. Poland was a relatively independent country, and this independence is showed by this fractional movement, which were sometimes very nationalistic or extreme nationalistic. Of course, we can criticize them, but at least they show that what in the anti-communist propaganda is called Soviet imperialism has no base. Maybe you have a question.
Okay. Wait, I will make something. When we speak about purge in the anti-Semitic purge in the party, we have also the question of the emigration, the 25,000 Polish Jews who are go out Poland. And I would like to ask you about the people.
Okay. I forgot. Okay, go on.
I would like to ask you about the people which were Marxist in 1950s, which are revisionists after, but all the time they were in Poland. I speak about Baczko, Kołakowski,
yes.
Other people who came into Paris, for example, or Sweden, on Western Europe, USA, and they were considered like leftist, revisionist, Marxist. I don't know.
Depending on the time.
Yes. What do you say about these people?
Yes, as I told you, I think that a lot of people joined the communist movement after the Second World War in Poland for different reasons, and even before the war. And not all of them were really convinced Marxist, or maybe they were at a certain time, but the basic reason of their choice was not Marxism, Leninism, building of socialist society. The reason of their belonging to the party could be very different. It could be Polish nationalism fighting against Germans, for example, since the Soviet Union realized in Poland the best hope for maximum Western borders in the West. That's one reason. Or the second reason, of course, when you came from national minorities, and that's the case of a lot of Jews, but also of Mozart, who come from the national minority, People's Poland opened them the way to social promotion. It was impossible to imagine in the pre-war Poland that a Ukrainian or a Jew could be at the top leadership of the country. It was possible in People's Poland to be minister from Jewish origin or from Ukrainian origin or from Belarusian origin. It was something real. And in this aspect, we can say People's Poland was much more internationalistic than not only Polish government before the war, but even Polish Socialist Party, who was a strictly Polish party, socialist, but still strictly Polish. Socialist Jews, for example, were not belonging to the PPS, they were belonging to the Bund. Ukrainian socialists were not in the PPS, they were in the Selrob, Ukrainian Socialist Social Democratic Party in Poland. So we had, even in the left, except for the communists, in the left, we had strictly national ethnical parties. And a communist movement was the only one which was not strictly ethnically based. And of course, it was a great appeal for a lot of people. But that's the good aspect of these things. But the bad aspect of these things was that quite a lot of people belonged to communist movement, not for strictly communist reasons, for different reasons, nationalistic or let's say para-nationalistic reason. And it's true for Poles, as I told you, for people with anti-German feelings, for example, anti-German, not anti-Nazi, anti-German, and it was also the case for people from Jewish or Ukrainian or Belarusian origin who were on the side of communists because it was the only party that accepted them for, let's say, social promotion. And this is important. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the situation changed because up to the creation of the State of Israel, most people from Jewish origin were looking at the Zionism as something unrealistic. So quite a lot of people who, let's say, could have been Zionist before 1948 didn't join the Zionist movement just for opportunistical reason, because they would have liked a Jewish state, but it was impossible according to them. And suddenly they discover in 1948 that this is possible. There is a Jewish state. And for example, Jakub Berman, he was the man in the direction of the Polish United Workers' Party responsible for security's question. But in the same time, his brother was the leader of the left-wing Zionist organization in Poland. And he was, of course, supported by his brother. And later, Adolf Berman emigrated to Israel. So in the 50s, you had Jakub Berman, who was a top leader in Poland, and his brother, Witold Berman, who was a leader of the, let's say it was the Israeli Workers' Party in Israel, which was, let's say, left Zionist, but still Zionist. So we have to take that into account. that this situation existed. And also, Soviet Union was praised by, let's say, anti-nationalist communists, Polish communists, as long as this country was supposed to fight against Polish nationalism. But as soon as it happened that this country is also fighting against Jewish nationalism, it means after the Golda Meir visit in Moscow, when quite a lot of Soviet Jews applauded her, and when she met Soviet leaders and told them that Israel will not be on the side of Soviet Union during the Cold War, and that Israel is much more linked with United States than with Soviet Union. Of course, this situation changed the policy of Soviet Union toward Israel, and quite a lot of people who joined communist movement in Poland for, let's say, anti-Polish nationalist reason, or against, of course, anti-Semitic tendencies inside the Polish society, they begin to look at United States and Western countries as countries, in fact, in their opinion, much less anti-Semitic than Eastern European societies. I'm not always not talking about state, but societies. So it explains why some people from Jewish origin change progressively their mind. But what is important to know is that it didn't change only minds of people from Jewish origin, because of course it is very important to understand that during the pre-war period, quite a lot of people, and especially intellectuals, but sometimes workers, from strictly Polish origin, were afraid, and they were, let's say, it was very rational, they were afraid against the anti-Semitism that existed in Poland, because there is something like anti-Semitism in Poland, especially within the church, not only, but especially within the church. So we had quite a lot of intellectuals from strictly Polish origin who considered that anti-Semitism was the worst thing functioning inside Polish society. So quite a lot of, let's say, progressive liberals, I'm not talking about communists, progressive liberals from Polish origin built their political identity around the idea we have to destroy anti-Semitism in Poland if we want to have an open-minded Polish society. So, when it happened in the middle of the 50s, that the Jewish issue, let's say like that, with a quote, the Jewish issue is not solved in People's Poland, since this issue continues to function, it's better to go west. Because in Western country, the question of anti-Semitism is solved, or apparently solved. And this created this trend of people who were, let's say, taking road with communists after the Second World War, and progressively deceived by the real socialism, and beginning to take into account this question. And I will also answer you to this question, giving you an anecdote. Of course, it's pure anecdote, but I think it's a quite important anecdote. One of my cousins was, let's say, married, not officially married, but anyway, she was from Jewish origin, and she had a boyfriend who was also a Jew in the 60s, 70s in Poland. And he was the son of the former, let's say, former director of the Warsaw Polish militia. So it's a very important function. He was the chief of the security forces of the police of the capital of Poland. I mean, it's a very important thing. And this man was fired in 1968. Of course, he was fired because he was old, and he had to go to retirement. But they pushed him to retirement. In other situations, he could have been left at his post. And so, of course, he was pushed away in the 1968. And somebody other took this function. But I had a discussion with his son, and his son told me, from the very beginning of my childhood, my parents, Jewish communists supposedly, told me, you have no future in Poland because you have of a Jewish origin, and Jews in Poland will always have a situation, a difficult situation. And he told me, I and my brother were brought up with the idea, okay, my parents have a job in Poland, but we will emigrate just after finishing our study. And he told me, my brother did emigrate in Sweden. And I was tough, and I decided I don't want to emigrate. They pushed me to emigrate. This is my country. I will stay in my country. And he told me I had different problems, of course, as everybody in Poland in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But basically, I had no problem. I had a quite good career, and I cannot tell that I had difficulty because of my Jewish origin. But I tell you, and he told me, all the people telling you that they emigrated to the West because they were under anti-Semitic pressure, including those in 1968, they tell you that they were repressed because of anti-Semitism and so on and so on. Of course, there is something like anti-Semitism in Poland. Of course, they had some not very sympathetic moments in their life due to that. But basically, their situation was not very tough. Basically, they are a quite good situation. They emigrated in the West because they knew that taking the anti-Semitic card, they will appear in the West, in France, in the United States, everywhere, as victims of the communism, and they will have open road to career in university, in very high-level university, like Kołakowski, like whose name? Bauman, yeah, and so on and so on and so on. And it gave me a lot of example, and of course he is right. He says, if they had told them, you can emigrate, but go to Czechoslovakia or Hungary, they would have stayed in Poland. And I mean, that's an anecdote, but still, I mean, it's an anecdote from the interior of the system. And he told me, I really feel I'm Pole, and as a Jew in Poland, during all the Polish People's Republic, I had nothing bad. Maybe 1 or 2 months in 1968 were bad, but not terror, just the situation not really fine. But basically, I'm the proof that the Polish anti-Semitism was not so strong in People's Poland as they say in the Western world, especially those immigrants who built their legend on the March 68 so-called repressions. That's an anecdote, of course, but still I think coming from somebody who has the right to tell that.
Okay, now I am totally different question. I would like to ask you about economy. Could you compare the period Gomułka with the period of Gierek. In the Polish media, it is showing that in the time of Gierek we have new clothes, we have the things colored from the West.
Yes.
And
Consumption society.
And yes, and also the politic Gomułka towards the bank. What is the difference, Gomułka for Gierek?
I would say that Gomułka, quote, socialism was something like a compromise between, let's say, working class socialism and petit bourgeois socialism. It was something like a planned economy with basically state sector, but some forms of private sector, especially in the agriculture, but not only in the agriculture, was accepted, officially accepted. And in the same time, we can say that the black market was repressed, but to a certain extent, not so much. That's why I would say that the Gomułka socialism was something like a petit bourgeois compromise between, let's say, the official socialist line and the Polish society reality. Gomułka, we can agree or not with him, but anyway, Gomułka was supposed to be a realist. And he was convinced that the Polish people cannot be pushed too quickly towards socialism. And that the party direction must consider the fact that basically the large majority of Polish people are not really pro-Soviet, one first thing, and are not really socialist-minded, that most of them are peasants. After the war, 70% of the Polish population were peasants, and that peasants have a petit bourgeois mentality, and that you cannot change that by administrative means. You have to progressively push them toward socialism. That's one thing. The second thing, but it's linked with what I said earlier. The second thing is that if you decide to build something like a middle-of-the-road socialism, you will not have socialism. You will have something in the middle. And especially since most of the agriculture belong to private sector, you will not be able to take taxes so strongly in the countryside to invest in the industrialization process. And the consequence of that, of course, is that Polish People's Republic developed. That's for sure. But the rhythm of development of Poland, comparing to Hungary, comparing to Czechoslovakia, comparing to East Germany, or comparing with the Western republics of Soviet Union, because we cannot judge Soviet Union as a whole. We must, of course, take into account the fact that Soviet Union was built in a country with very, very, very strong regional differences, and that Kazakhstan or Tajikistan is not Lithuania or Belarusia for different reasons, economical, historical, sociological, cultural, and different situations. So if we compare Poland with Soviet Union, we cannot compare Poland with Soviet Union. We have to compare what is comparable. It means Poland with Lithuania, Poland with Belarusia, Poland with Ukraine, or Estonia, not with, let's say, all Soviet Union. Especially, you will never compare Polish economy with Tajikistan's economy. So if we compare the rhythm of development of People's Poland with all neighboring countries, including Soviet Republic, Poland was developing less quickly than all these countries. So and it's very logical, because since you have no collectivization, you have no way to take strong taxes from the agriculture to invest them in the industry. So, of course, the rhythm of development cannot be so quick that in the country who use agriculture as an investment tool to most developed economical sector, means, of course, a sector linked with the industry. So in this way, we can, of course, consider that the Gomułka road towards socialism, I would not say was a failure, but was a weak development strategy comparing to neighboring countries. But anyway, Gomułka's Poland was developing quickly. And we, even with what I told earlier, Polish People's Republic under Gomułka did develop quite quickly. And the proof of what I say is that I remember in 1968 or 1969, I don't exactly remember, the front page of the West German, very well-known newspaper, Der Spiegel, had the title, and I will tell it in German and then translate it in English, Polnische Wunder zwischen Oder und Bug. It means the Polish miracle between Oder and Bug. And, you know, Der Spiegel is not communist-minded newspaper. So when such a newspaper, and I remember that West Germany at that time was still in state of war with Poland because the border were not recognized. So before, at the end of the Gomułka era, you had a very important West German media analyzing economical situation in Poland and giving to Gomułka's Poland the qualification that he realized an economical miracle out of Poland. That's very important because for in the German culture, traditional culture, and especially in the German culture of the 20th century, what is called Polnische Wirtschaft, it means Polish economy, is always looked as something completely backyard, archaic. Poles are supposed to be completely inefficient in economical and working organization. So when you see a West German paper giving the frontline page Polnische Wunder, it means, you know, they accepted the fact that in spite of their traditional German stereotype of Poles not able to work correctly, to organize work correctly, to organize economy correctly, contrary, of course, of the very efficient Germans. It is very important to notice that because it means that the West Germans at the end of Gomułka era were taking into account that the fact that in spite of all what I thought, Poland was an efficient country. Poland became, under Polish People's Republic, an efficient economical country. Of course, you will never find this article now in Poland. It would be very good to find it back and translate for Poles, because then they would understand what Poland realized, what People's Poland realized, according to anti-Polish Germans in the 60s. Anyway, what is important is when I told is Gomułka was something like a compromise with a petit bourgeois economy. And of course we can say that Gomułka was also a petit bourgeois in that sense that he was counting, you know, like a petit bourgeois, 1 + 1 gives 2. It doesn't give 3. Gomułka was very aware of the fact that Poland couldn't, for example, take loans. Because if you take loans, you have to pay them back. And if you pay them back, you pay them back with interest. And this is not good for economy. So he was very, very careful. That's the first thing. The second thing, he was always promoting investment, mostly in the direction of new construction of bases of economy. And he was always considering, let's say, consumption as something that can come in the second time. I give you another anecdote that will explain you that very well. In Poland, we had at that time a lot of jokes, political jokes. And one of the jokes, and this joke for me is very important, is that supposedly Gomułka is looking at the trade relation of Poland with foreign countries, and there is a position, citrus. And he says, why citrus import to Poland? Poles said they have vitamin C, and they have vitamin C in the cabbage. We don't need citrus. We have vitamin C. And his secretary tell the Poles that they have to push cabbage in their tea. Because you know, in Poland we drink tea with citrus, so they will tell them that we have to put them cabbage and not citrus. Of course, it's an anecdote, it's a joke. I don't know if Gomułka if it happened, but it's the Polish economy at the time of Gomułka. Second, Gomułka was very clever because the history confirmed what he thought. He was always telling, we cannot take loans from Western countries because capitalism is going to collapse. So at the moment when capitalists will collapse, we will import their crisis in our country. And that's another important point. When Gierek came to power, he came to power in a country which was developed. And then he began to say, no, okay, the Poles, they have to live in a better way. So we will let them consume, and not only plan further development of the strategical sectors, but we will give them more in the shops. And he did it, of course. And that's why, of course, during the Gierek era, I lived in Poland at that time. I was in Poland in 1969, the last year of Gomułka, and I was very young then, but still I remember. And I was, of course, living in Poland in the 70s, and I remember, of course, that in the 1969 Poland, the shops were full of basic articles, but just of basic articles. You had tea, you had cabbages, you had a bit of meat, you had all what you need basically to have a decent life. But you had no luxury, that's for sure. And you had especially no possibility to go to the dollar shops and buy luxuries in dollar, because you had to prove that you had earned these dollars legally. And a Pole could have legally dollars from two sources. Either he was going in the West working legally and then coming back to Poland legally with dollars. For example, a Polish musician with his Philharmony was giving a concert in New York. He received salary in dollar. Then he came back in Poland. He could buy in the dollar shop. But because he was legally, he earned legally money in New York. Or because you had family in the West that sent you money in dollar, then you had legally dollars and you could use them. But at the Gierek changed completely that, because when Gierek arrived to power, he decided that in the dollar shop, you just have to show the dollar, you don't have to show where they come from. So it means that the black market of dollar developed. At that time, in the 70s, you couldn't come from the Western countries in the street, coming from Western country, not being asked by people, oh, you're coming from Canada, do you want to sell dollars? It was massive. I know that very well because I was in the student hostel. I was coming from Canada, and I had a lot of my friends coming from different countries in West or South, from third world countries, where dollar or foreign Western money were. And it was all the time people knocking at your door. Do you have a dollar to sell? Do you have dollar to sell? And of course, it was on black market course. And to a certain extent, of course, it allowed Poles to buy goods, luxury goods that they couldn't buy earlier, but it created a two-level Poland. One Poland living because of black market activities, it means anti-social and anti-socialist activities, and another Poland which had to live according to socialist salaries. And it was the beginning of of what I can say a complete demoralization, because you had a two-level Poland, and the best Poland in terms of standard of living was the Poland that was sabotaging the economy, and not the Poland that was working hardly. And that's very important, this element. The second thing is that Gierek told at the beginning of the 70s, we were always thinking that the Western capitalism will collapse. 30 years after the war, it didn't happen. So it means that maybe Marx was right in the 19th centuries, but now capitalism has evolved, capitalism is changing, capitalism is not having a cyclical crisis as earlier. It was the time when it was very fashionable, especially in Polish university. I learned that in Polish university at political science courses, the so-called theory of convergency. The theory of convergency that was supposedly the fact that the West is becoming more and more socialist, like Sweden, for example, and the East is becoming more and more democratic. And at the end, the Cold War will finish, and humanity will be linked in something like a social liberal ideal society. Of course, this was not the official line of the party, but it was a very strong line in Poland at that time. And I remember that I had teachers of political science that were on the side of this convergency theory. So it means you can take loan in the West because West is more developed. West will not have crisis. So we will very easily pay back loans because our industry will develop, and then all the goods we produced, we will sell them in Western countries for dollars. But of course, they forgot one thing, and Gierek forgot one thing, that it was still the Cold War, and that there was the so-called COCOM. It means that Eastern countries, socialist countries, couldn't import everything from the West, especially high technology. And that for this reason, the consumption article produced in Poland will not be competitive on the Western market because they have not the technology, the technologies developed by big Western capitalist firms. So the Polish Fiat will not be competitive with the French Peugeot or the General Motors Chevrolet. Because you import from the West Fiat, but the low-level Fiat, not the real top Fiat. And I give you, of course, the example of Fiat, but it was in all articles the same thing. So socialist country couldn't compete with more developed, for historical reason, Western country, and that's why when Poland took the loans, at the beginning it was very fine because you had all the advantage created by Gomułka, Poland, the development of Poland during Gomułka, plus the loans, and all that gave a very everyday fine life in Poland. But at the end of the 70s, you had to pay back that loans. And then you have the crisis in the West that happened in 1973, 1975. And Poland had to pay back loans with very high interest rates, and it couldn't afford it. And then the economy went down. In 1979, 1980, for the first time after the Second World War, at the end of the year, there was no economical expansion but regression in 1979. So at the end of Gierek era. So I would say that Gomułka, of course, maybe he was wrong for a lot of reasons, but he was not so naive, let's say naive, as was Gierek. Gierek was a fine man. I mean, of course, to go with Gierek in coffee shop was very fine. I mean, I met him in the Akademia Górniczo-Hutnicza in 1976 or 7, I don't remember. He was a fine guy. I mean, he was a very good man.
You speak personally with Gierek?
I mean, we were all students and we had discussion with him. I think he never remembered me. But, you know, I had something like a collective discussion with him. And, of course, he was a very fine guy. I guess he was even more sympathetic than Gomułka. If we had to go to coffee shop and to discuss, he was much more, you know, fine and recreative and open-minded. But basically, I would say Gomułka was much more rationalistic than Gomułka. He knew Poland was a non-advanced country and had to mobilize to conquer the level of development. He did. And of course, we always say, I don't know why, that at Gierek's time, Poland began the 10th industrial country in the world. But it's not at Gierek's time. It's in 1969. In 1969, the last year of Gomułka, Poland began the 10th industrial economy in the world. So Gierek based all his consumption society on this Gomułka success. We have to remember Poland was the 10th industrial economy in the world. Czechoslovakia was the 8th. Czechoslovakia was the 9th. East Germany was the 8th, and Soviet Union was the 2nd. So when we say socialism is inefficient, it's pure stupidity. Because if we look at the level Poland, Czechoslovakia, eastern part of Germany, and Russia had in 1913, they were far behind 50s. Industrial level, because we have always to remember that the Eastern Germany was the poorest part of Germany. So the German Democratic Republic was built on the poorest part of the German territory, not on the richest part. So we cannot compare Eastern Germany with Western Germany. It's not fair. It's just as if the United States, we decided to create a socialist state in Dakota, and we would say, oh, look, Dakota is backward comparing to, let's say, California. Of course, Dakota is backward comparing to California because Dakota is Dakota and it's not California. So if you have two different states, Dakota will not have the standard of living of California. And it's the same in Eastern Germany. We have always to remember that from the Middle Ages, the basic economical border in Europe is on the Elbe River. It cut Germany in two, and all countries east of Elbe are, let's say, backward, and west are richer. And if we understand that all the illusion we had after 1989 that if former socialist country goes west, they will cease to be archaic. Of course, socialism was just real socialism was just a short moment in the history trying to catch up Western countries, and it succeeded. It means socialist countries in the 80s were almost on the edge of being successful to catch up West. And the tragedy is that it's in the same time that what I would define as counter-revolutionaries took power, country after countries in socialist countries. They took power at the moment when socialism was becoming successful. In Poland, in Hungary, in Yugoslavia, of course, and then in Soviet Union.
Okay, I would like to ask you about one thing. It's concerned the multinational IKEA. He produced the furniture. Today we have situation in the global capitalism that the countries like China or Vietnam are working for the multinationals especially from the Western countries, and they are known that they offer the cheap labor and stuff like that. And recently I discovered that in 1961 a small society from Sweden signed with Poland they started to cooperate, and Poland starts to produce all this stuff for IKEA, and IKEA became the biggest multinational in the world. He produced the stuff, the furniture. My question is, why is Gomułka is Poland in the time of Gomułka was the first country which started to collaborate with the multinational from the Western countries and offer the cheaper labor?
Poland at the Gomułka time did that, but I would say at the experimental level, under very strong, strict state control. It was rather, I would say, an experimentation at the Gomułka time, because there were a strong tendency in the economical sector of the party to push in that direction, but to a certain extent Gomułka did harm that tendency. We have always to think something that the Communist Party, whatever we think about them, how they function, they are not one-man direction. Even at the Stalin time, Stalin was not an absolute leader, just deciding what was going on. A party was an organization functioning more or less democratically, but it was always an organization where you had different tendencies. And the general secretary was not the absolute leader. He had to manage a relation with different groups. And in Poland, of course, in the 60s, you had, Gierek didn't happen, from the sky. Gierek was the representative in the 60s, already during Gomułka time, of, let's say, the fraction, the so-called realistic fraction. It means the fraction that was against all theoretical discussions about Marxism, about nationalism, about whatever you want. It was the realistical or pragmatical fraction. And basically, we have to know that Gierek was a social democrat. And when I tell that, he told that. Of course, he didn't told that in 60s and 70s, but after 1989, he told in an interview, I was always social democrat, but I was communist just because in France the communists were the only working class party that accepted foreigners, because the socialists didn't. So he was very clear about that. But so that, of course, explained why he was a strong pragmatic in the 60s. And he was one of the leaders pushing toward the direction you say. And to a certain extent, Gomułka refrained. He accepted the fact that some cooperation with Western enterprise can be done, but let's say as experiments, not as a general line. It is during the 70s that the economy really opened to what is called in Poland licencja. It means the buying of technologies, suppose, in Western enterprise, like the Fiat, for example. Relation, but quite a lot of other enterprises began to produce for Western capitalist, of course, enterprises, mostly during the Gierek time, because then it was not experimental. It was the official line that Western countries are more developed, Western enterprises are more developed, so we have to learn from them, not only learn from them on the economical basis, like you say, but I remember, that's also quite anecdotal, but anyway, I remember that in the summer 1974, I guess, one of my friends was studying at Krakow University Swedish language. And he told me, the lektorka, the lecturer of Swedish, she's Swedes. She came because the Swedish university has an agreement with the Krakow University, and she's proposing me to have a student to have work in the paper factory, toilet paper factory of Lillehedet in Sweden. Would you like to come with me to Sweden, and we would work there? Why not? I mean, I had nothing to do in the summer, and being worker in the summer in Sweden, why not? So I went there, and there I met quite a lot of Polish workers, especially from the Gdańsk shipyard, that were working in Sweden for summer. I mean, 2 months work in July and August, and coming back to Poland. But that's not the most important. The most important is that when I was at that university, at that factory, excuse me, I met in the administration of the factory 2 Poles that were coming from the SGPiS. SGPiS, it's the Institute of Statistics and Planning of the Warsaw, in Warsaw, which was really the economical think tank of the Polish economical elite. And those two students were there sent to a Swedish factory, not to work as worker as I did, but to work as bureaucrats and learn how to manage a good enterprise in the capitalist way, because I mean it was a private society. So I mean Polish state paid two of its students in the elite school to go and learn capitalist management and come back to Poland, of course, in that purpose. And the end of the story is that this man I knew, I met in the 70s in Lilla Edet in Sweden, then came back to Poland, finished his study, became one of the high functionaries of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in People's Poland. And in 1989, he was named he was Polish United Workers Member Party. And in 1989, he was named by the Mazowiecki government the man in charge of the depolitization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And 1 year later, he was ambassador of Poland in the United States. You understand the way. I mean, between the party school, Swedish capitalist enterprise, functionary of the Polish People's Republic Foreign Ministry, leader of the depolitization, it means the decommunization of the ministry, and then ambassador in the United States. You understand this, and of course I remember him in the 70s. He was a great admirer of Gierek, and he was always showing Gomułka as an idiot, as an archaic, as an old man, as a stupid man, as a provincial man, not understanding the whole world, how it's working. Gierek is an open-minded to the world man, and so on and so on and so on. So I mean, you see the ideological preparation from the Gomułka era, whatever we can think about Gomułka. But anyway, you see that there was something like an ideological preparation from Gomułka era through Gierek era up to the nowadays liberal Poland, capitalist, of course. And that's very logical. And the difference, for me, the difference was that I saw that, but in the same time, I was in Poland militant in the Polish student organization for hardline communism. And I remember, I finished with that anecdote, I remember that there was an African communist delegation that came to Poland, and I received them because I was at the foreign department of the Socialist Union of Students, and I had a very good relation with them, and I had a talk with them how we Polish communists can help Senegalese communists to, giving them a machine to produce leaflets and so on. And I did that, and I negotiated that. And then I went to Warsaw because it was in Krakow. And then I went to Warsaw and I met the man I told you who was in Sweden, but in the administration, because at the time he was leader of the foreign department of the Socialist Union of Students for Warsaw. And I met him, and he told me, "Oh, I see that you are very Africanized now." As if it was, he was Westernized and I was Africanized. So, he was he was joking, but to a certain extent, his joke was, I was the third world backward, and he was the, future ambassador of the Poland in United States. And it was in the 70s.
Yes. Bruno, I hope that you are not tired, because I want to ask you last question about the politic Gomułka towards the Catholic Church.
That's a very good question, because I told you about the peasant question, I told you about the national question, but of course the church question is very important. And that is the same thing. Of course, that Gomułka philosophically was a Marxist. He was not at all a Catholic. He was from Catholic background, but of course he was a pure Marxist in his relation toward church. There is no problem about that. But he was also very aware of the fact that church in Poland had not only a strong religious legitimacy, because it's not the most important. If we want to understand church in Poland, we have to understand that church has a strong national legitimacy, that's one thing, and has also a strong traditional legitimacy for a different reason. It means Poland was a poor country, and church is a very intelligent organization. Because as you know, priests, they don't marry. And if they don't marry, officially at least, they have no children. And it means that at every generation, church has to recruit new members to develop. Or just to exist, because in a normal society, somebody has a good place. He wants to push his children at this place. But if there are no children, it has nobody to push. And in an archaic country like Poland, church was, and it's very important to take that into account, it was the only institution in the countryside where peasants had the hope that their children, especially their son, will have a better situation than to be a peasant. So for peasant, it was very important to have at least one son going to the seminary, because it was the standard living of the family that was going up, and that's why one of the reasons why in archaic country, Catholic Church, especially Catholic Church, is strong. I mean, why was Catholic Church strong in Spain before of now? I mean, in 30 or 50 years ago. Why Catholic Church was strong in Italy? Why Catholic Church was strong in Ireland? Or why Catholic Church was strong in Quebec? Not only because of national reasons, sometimes you had national reasons like in Poland or in Ireland or in Quebec, but not always. In Spain or in Italy, you had no national question and the church was strong. But church was strong basically because it was recruiting new members from the lower classes of society at every generation. And for this reason, Poland was traditionally in Poland an institution considered by peasants as the only way of social promotion, because country was not industrialized. I mean, a son of Polish peasant couldn't imagine to be even worker. But of course, not administrator, not judge, no advocate, no surgeon. It was unrealistic for them. He could dream, my son will be a priest. Because to be a priest, it is a very good economical position in a traditional archaic country. Whatever you think about God, whatever you think about Bible, that's a second question. But basically, it was a very useful organization for individual promotion. Of course, not for social promotion, for individual promotion. And for this reason, church was a strong organization, especially after the Second World War, because the country was destroyed. So at the very beginning, it was also, after the war, also difficult for son of peasant to see their son going up. After it will change, but that's just after the war, it was difficult. And the second situation, it was because whatever we think about church during the war, Polish church during the war was repressed by the Nazis. About 1/4 of priests were killed during the Second World War because they were part of the resistance movement. I mean, even if in the church you have strong extreme right currents, even the extreme right, as I told you earlier, was in the resistance. So, I mean, at the end of the war, and it was completely different in, let's say, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, or Yugoslavia, where church collaborated with Nazi or pro-Nazi regime. In Poland, it was not the case. So, after the war, the church had a patriotical legitimacy equal to all other tendencies in the society. So because of all these reasons, church was strong in Poland, and Gomułka took that into account. Maybe he was wrong, but that's another thing. But anyway, he was sure that church cannot be eradicated by administrative level, because it will push Poles to demonstrate and so on. And to a certain extent, he was right, because, for example, when the socialist Poland created the new city, the new socialist city of Nowa Huta near Krakow, it was planned without church. And during the whole 50s and 60s, there were riots and demonstrations of workers coming from peasant family in the new city, asking for the right to build church. And Gomułka opposed that to a certain extent, but basically he tried to have compromise with church. The second element we have to take into account is that Polish church at that time was under the rule of Wyszynski. And Wyszynski was, of course, we cannot agree with him on a lot of questions, because he was for sure a reactionary man, but he was aware of two things. The first thing he was aware of is that in People's Poland, the church has to have bishops coming from peasant families, and not like in the pre-war period from aristocracy. So he paysanized the church. We can even say that he carried on a class struggle within the church in favor of peasants against the former aristocracy. That's one thing. Of course, it was under the influence of socialism. He had to do that. The Hungarian didn't, and that's why the Hungarian church collapsed, because Midzenti was an aristocrat, and it was very easy for a Hungarian communist to tell, oh, look at this church, it's the aristocratic institution. But Polish church was paysanized under Wyszynski. That's one thing. And the second thing, which is important, is Wyszynski. Of course, he was anti-communist, but Wyszynski was mostly considering that the main threat to Poland, not to People's Poland, to Poland, is coming from the West. Is coming from the West, and especially from Germany. And that in this situation, it's better to have good relation with Soviet Union for national patriotical reason, not for ideological reason, but for national patriotical reason. But also, in the same time, he was advocating the fact that in spite of its atheism, Soviet Union is built along moral lines that fits more to Catholic tradition than Western liberal countries. For example, he told that Soviet films are moral. And in fact, a Christian, a moral Christian, can look at Soviet films because basically the moral of these films is acceptable for Catholics.
But wait. He writes it. It is possible to find it.
He did it even in the 70s during the Gierek time. So he told that in the 60s, but also in the 70s. And it was obvious. I mean, I remember in the 70s when I was in Poland, you had in every church, at the entry of the church, you had the list of films that were shown in cinemas of the city. And you had, of course, Soviet films, Hungarian films, American films, Italian films, French films. And there was a short appreciation of this film. And at the end, it was written, this film, a good Catholic can go to look at him or not. And most often, Western film was forbidden. And Soviet film were okay. Because, Italian film, Fellini's film and so on, they were judged immoral for Catholic values. But, film of the Red Army fighting for the fatherland and for the family, for his wife and so on, were considered as Catholic-minded. So we had competition between Gomułka and Wyszynski, very strong competition. Who is the real representative of Polish patriotism, church or party? But in the same time, the party was always considering that the church can be taken in the direction of social progress. Which was an error, because basically, as we can observe now, the church didn't change. The discourse of Wyszynski was top at that time, but basically, church behaved still like pre-war church. And educated people like pre-war church in not only anti-communism, which is logical, but in not accepting a lot of questions that were introduced during People's Poland, like abortion law, like let's say secularized education and so on. I would say Gomułka was, to a certain extent, naive, thinking that he could fight with Wyszynski, but in the same time allowing church to have what we can say privileges. Because, in People's Poland, and not only at Gierek's time, at Gomułka's time, I remember in 1969, I visited Poland, and I remember the priests, they had cars. Nobody had cars in Poland at that time. They had cars. They had one lady working for them for free. They had big houses. The bishops had palaces, not houses, palace. And up till now, they live in palace. The only Poles that had palace were bishops. The first secretary of the party was living in a normal block. Apartment, but the Archbishop of Poland had several palaces in Poland, not only in Warsaw. He had one in Gniezno, he had one in Krakow, and so on and so on. They were a rich power. And you have the quality of their I don't know how would you say in English the clothes the priests are wearing. Anyway, their clothes. You saw that it was a very good quality. You had not that in the shops. They were much better dressed than any other Poles. So, and you know, they had a lot of service for free because most of their parishmen were helping them, giving them food, everything for free. So, I mean, it was a real powerful institution. And to a certain extent, I must recognize Gomułka was much too tolerant toward church, according to me, because he accepted things. I can understand he accepted them, but at least he could criticize them much more strongly. And, the Polish party relation toward church was always very ambiguous. But even in the Stalin time, because we have to remember one thing that they will never tell you, that during the Stalin time, religion courses were in public schools. Gomułka in 1956 suppressed religion courses in schools. In 1956, Gomułka forced church to have courses in churches, not in schools, not in public schools. Religion is eliminated from public schools. Gomułka in 1956, he introduced.
But in the time of Bierut, there was.
Religion, Catholic religion, was compulsory in the public school. We have to remember that Bierut had not the courage or the force to eliminate that. In the same time, at the Bierut time, abortion was forbidden.
Yes, but in the Bierut time, he arrested Wyszyński and many others.
Yes, of course. Because there was officially at the Bierut time, we had a fight against reactionary church. But officially, there was the reactionary church and the progressive church. The problem is that, in fact, we had no progressive church, or almost no progressive church. But theoretically, we had that in the same time he arrested Wyszyński, he didn't suppress religion courses in the schools, because he was always trying to have some churchmen on his side. I can understand that tactic. I'm not condemning. I can understand that tactic, but I just have to acknowledge that this tactic didn't work. And that's why when Gomułka arrived, he took into account the fact that in 1956 he was very popular. So he passed two laws that were anti-church, but he knew that at that time the church couldn't sell nothing. The first law was religion courses are outside of the school and abortion is legal. That was 256 laws. And in spite of that, because he was very popular in January 57, you had the general election, and at the general election, the church appealed to vote for Gomułka and to participate in the election. It was the only time in People's Poland that the church officially accepted to vote in favor of the regime in January 57, because it was impossible for the church at that moment to appeal to not to vote.
So if we want to have good relations with church, we have to
you have to be very strong.
No, but not strong. We have to attack church. When we legalize abortion, when we smash out the church from the schools, they will say we have to vote the communists.
Yeah, you to a certain extent, that's right. But because it was the balance of force was at that time in favor of the party. But you have to take into account the fact that the party, that Gomułka was popular at that time, that he could do that because he knew that the people are behind him and that the church cannot be against him. But 2 or 3 years later, the situation has changed. and the church came back. And we have, of course, always to think about the fact that, church is an old organization, 2,000-year organization, and they know how to manage people and how to manage societies. They are not stupid. I mean, that's a very strong intellectual organization. And we cannot underestimate the intelligence of churchmen. We can, of course, condemn them for this or that, but we cannot think that it's a stupid organization. It's not a stupid organization. It's, they have a very strong tradition to adapt to very different regime and to work inside. And that they did in Poland. I mean, they succeeded. They succeeded in people's Poland. They managed to create a counter society that won at the end. I mean, they won. They won in 1989. They did win. I mean, we can, of course, be mad at that fact, but we cannot ignore the fact that they were on the good side of the front. We were not.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. It is 2 hours of our conversation, which we record. I will finish our conversation, but don't quit. I will say you something.
Okay.
Okay. Wait.